Hello, lovely AC community. It's Anya here, and I am covering for Ross today. And I have my special guest today, Dr. Saleena Subaiya, a psychedelic researcher at Columbia University and also a private practitioner with keen passion for visual art and nature. Salina has been focusing on researching COVID and psychedelic treatments. Welcome, Salina. How are you today?
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm doing well. So happy to be here.
Oh, I'm really happy and honored to host you here, and I'm sure our community will be really interested in your work and your story. And without further ado, I'm not going to be reading your bios because people hate that. I would like to hear from you about you. And my first question is really, um, you know, we know that you're researching long COVID, and we know this is because of your personal story. So I suppose if you could just tell me about your first experiences with COVID and how it then um, evolved into long COVID, and what were the key turning points on your journey?
Yeah. So I'm a board certified emergency medicine doctor. So during the pandemic, I was working on the front lines. And that was in and of itself a life-changing experience to see what New York City went through and to see what our hospitals had to deal with and what we personally had to deal with to show up for something like that. And about a year into the pandemic, I began developing these very classic at the time long COVID symptoms, but it was so early on, so no one really knew what they were. But I was unable to read, I was unable to balance, I was unable to hold a conversation for more than 15 minutes. I was in bed 20 hours a day. I had just gotten hit by a train. And interestingly, my partner, who is also a researcher, had been researching long COVID inadvertently. He'd been studying the COVID virus. And he was the one that said, listen, like in a lot of my patients, I'm seeing these symptoms, and I feel like you might actually have the same exact thing. And so that began my own personal journey, which was very intense. I had to leave my clinical work. I was so ill. I took a research job in something that I'm very passionate about, which is psychedelics. And I'd been researching ceremonial ayahuasca the year before that. And so it was a natural segue, but probably not one that I would have made so abruptly. And that's sort of the journey of how I pivoted into doing psychedelic research and private practice now full time.
Thank you. And so when I was reading your story, I found this information you were writing that one of the physicians was actually not actually believing that it's long COVID and thinking about people having PTSD. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very, very challenging time in 2021. If you recall, there were so many viewpoints of where COVID originated from and if it was a conspiracy. And so there was just this idea that conspiracies were in the air around the pandemic. And, you know, when I first started going to doctors to get MRIs and I had to get spinal tap, I had to get blood tests. I mean, it was a whole battery of tests. And I would describe to them what I was going through, and they would say, I think that this is stress from working during the pandemic, or this is PTSD from your job. And I would look at them and say, listen, I worked in public health and international disasters. I've been evacuated from places that have had riots and, you know, active shooting. I have not experienced the inability to read or the inability to hold a conversation in those moments. I'm like, this is distinctly different. I think I, the way that Western medicine trains us, and myself included, is that when symptoms cannot be placed into a clear diagnostic box, they are pushed into psychiatric, mental health. I don't want to think about it. And I really am in some ways grateful for the COVID pandemic. I hate to say that, but we now have to deal with a novel disease, novel symptoms, and we're being pushed to see that there are things that we can't just put into a box, and we have to really change how we think in Western medicine and how we treat patients who are coming to us with very, very real concerns. And so, in that way, long COVID changed me and how I would approach a patient like me and how I would approach care for a patient like me. After about 8 months of really seeing some of the leading long COVID researchers, because that's all there was at the time. There wasn't long COVID as a specialty. This was just emerging. So they were people who had been studying COVID, inadvertently stumbled on long COVID, and decided, hey, let me think about this in my own practice. So after 8 months of seeing these doctors who were leading the charge and, really, really brilliant, I realized I wasn't making enough progress. I just was still really sick. I was still in bed all the time. I was still very, very fatigued. And so what I realized was like I have this opportunity within myself as a researcher and a doctor to not only observe the illness and observe what happens when I say I push too much or eat a certain thing or do something that is more holistic, like meditate or activate my parasympathetic nervous system. I'm literally a human experiment. And so I began, paying very, very close attention and listening. And in listening to myself, I've learned, how to take care of myself, how to build protocols to take care of others, and also combine that with my knowledge of research and science. And my hope is that doctors can learn to listen in the way that patients are forced to listen.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for sharing this. Um, yeah, it's interesting because I was about to ask you about, what challenges were you managing with long COVID, and how did this shape your perspective on healthcare and recovery? And you kind of covered this a bit now, but anything to add about that?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the largest challenges, one of the largest challenges outside of just not being stigmatized or gaslit. I think that that's something that's very, very prevalent and unfortunate in the long COVID community, um, is making space for novel treatments and ideas to be accepted and integrated into care. And I think this is something that again has shifted both my how I think as a researcher and how I think as a physician, because we usually have mountains of evidence if we're going to decide to recommend an intervention to a patient, especially someone who's very, very sick.
Yeah.
That's traditionally how medicine has gone. Or if we don't have mountains of evidence, we have years of practice where we're like, okay, we give this medication for an asthma attack. We're always going to give it. This is what we do. And so what do we do when we have something completely novel? What do we do when we have a patient coming to us and they're like, "Hey, I really want to try psilocybin because I've heard that someone got better with it." And what do you think? I think one of the biggest challenges is shifting the way that we think and being open to people coming to us with this and not just shutting them down and saying, well, I don't know anything about that, or there's no data, or something terrible could happen, because people are desperate and people are trying things. And for some people, those things are actually working.
Yeah.
They're outside of the traditional medical pharmacologic paradigm. And so it's really critical that, yeah, again, like I said, we create space for that. And that has definitely been a challenge. Both, as someone who wants to care for a patient, but also as someone who is going to receive care.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds similar to like women healthcare anyways, like all the endometriosis and all those things, the gaslighting, they're like, you're just crazy. But also what you said now made me think of cannabis in the UK, and it's so helpful for so many women with endometriosis and other conditions, and you can get it prescribed privately, but NHS here only prescribed issued 5 prescriptions since it was medically legalized, and it's quite a 5 in years. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting one that they just don't want to. They're scared of the novel therapies, and I agree so much with you that this needs to change because not everything works. Not this the same stuff doesn't work for everyone, obviously.
I
So
I
yeah,
think one other thing too, I think is worth noting is, and this has been a struggle and a challenge for medicine for so many years. And again, I'm hoping that with the, with psychedelics being more popular, and also with, I guess, just like wellness becoming a more popular thing, is the acceptance of other cultural contexts and paradigms of healing. There are so many traditions that have been doing this for thousands of years. And while they may not have randomized controlled trials, people don't do things for 2000 years because they weren't working. They do things because they've, like, this worked, and oral tradition and through families, they've been passing down these arts. And I think that this is something that, I actually am, it's been challenging, but I think more and more and more people are seeking out these alternative modalities, not just psychedelics, but also things like Eastern medicine or Ayurveda, other types of indigenous medicines. And, I see Western medicine struggling with how to integrate all of this.
Yeah.
I also see it as a time where this is needed now more than ever.
No, totally. I mean, there's so many communities as well that are completely alienated by the medical system that, been heard by medical system in the past. They definitely um seeking something more connected to their roots. I don't know if you know Akuya Fosuchne. She runs African spiritual practices and organizes those events where it's not just about psychedelics but all kinds of alternative treatments. And it's so beautiful to see that so many people come and like reconnect with this knowledge and their ancestry. So I can definitely see the trend, and I do hope that medical system catches up. And I don't know, do you feel there is a future of legal psychedelics being given in more community settings by doulas and elders and not necessarily in like by a therapist and stuff? What do you think about this model in the future?
Oh man, the
That's what we all want.
well, I think what I think about it, and whether or not within the US is, what I'm most familiar with our system, like whether or not I hope we can see that in our lifetime. It's unclear, but what I can say is that what you're describing is something that has been done already for thousands of years in community. And this is a very traditional way of healing in South American communities. It's a traditional way of healing in West African communities. Like there are models for this that exist and that work in places where these medicines are legal, outside of the Western paradigm. And so, do I believe in them? I would say I do believe in them. Do I believe that we have the appropriate cultural context and tools and history to be able to implement something like this, and the level of ethics and boundaries and attention that is needed for this to work? I'm not sure. I want to hope and believe that we can. But again, we're talking about a completely different cultural paradigm. It's shifting a cultural paradigm.
Yeah, that's what you said. I don't, maybe not in our lifetime. There's a lot of education before and a lot of structures that need to be built. So thank you so much. I just want to go back to your research now. So could you just tell me how your journey with long COVID intersected with your work in psychedelic research?
Yeah. So I had been researching ceremonial ayahuasca for about a year before I got sick with long COVID. And I remember I was, taking a deep dive into the physiology, the physiology of how DMT works in the brain and its anti-inflammatory properties, and how it can help brain cells survive in low oxygen environments. And then that took me on another deep dive of just exploring other serotonergic hallucinogens, as well as ketamine, which was one of the medicines we were working with in some of our trials at Columbia. And I realized, we don't fully understand yet how long COVID works. We don't understand the pathophysiology of this illness. But I was witnessing it within my body. I was witnessing what would happen if I was on my feet for too long and my brain wasn't getting sufficient blood flow. I would witness what happened if I used too much cognitive power, and I would become fatigued after. And so I was sort of witnessing the pathophysiology of long COVID in my body because there was barely any data out at the time. And I was thinking, I really believe that these mechanisms can be married somehow. Like I believe the way that psychedelics work may impact and improve the health of people with long COVID. So we actually added a series of questions to our ayahuasca survey that specifically asked about long COVID. And we had about, 24 people that did have long COVID. And that actually, about half of them were saying that they had some mild improvement. We had some that say that they didn't improve. But overall, there were people who were working with these medicines who also had these symptoms. We also did another survey looking at every psychedelic and asking people with long COVID whether or not they had any improvement or if they had any worsening, or some things got better and some things got worse. And we're still looking at that data, but it's about the same. There's half of the people say that they're getting better from things like psilocybin and ketamine. Some people say there's no change. I would say it's the rare number that say that they're being harmed by these medicines. So that spurred us to launch several pilot studies, and they're currently in various stages of recruitment and beginning to launch. And that's where we are today. The caveat I want to say about the data that I just mentioned and how some people are reporting an improvement and maybe some people aren't reporting any change at all is that, this is likely in a group of people who are not psychedelic naive, right? These are people who have experience with psychedelics, that likely have tried them before in the past. And I say this because, when it comes to chronic illness and the use of psychedelics, I think it's something that needs to be held very, very delicately. It has to be something that ideally is supported by a provider or a therapist or a guide who understands the illness and some of the dangers and having a very, very intense experience, what that can do to someone's health. I just wanted to throw that caveat in there as I share these pieces of data.
Of course. So there's going to be a lot of studies, going to probably take quite a long time, but hopefully we can hear back from you once they're completed. In the meantime, so far from what you see, can you tell me what are the most exciting potential for psychedelics in addressing long COVID, but also in general chronic health conditions?
So there is data that shows that psychedelics can help improve quality of life in individuals with chronic conditions. The point that we're at right now as a scientific community is these studies are small, and we need much larger studies to see how psychedelics can impact things like chronic fatigue and brain fog. These are very, very specific symptoms that we need a larger sample size to look at, but we do know that there's been an improvement in quality of life. I think that there's promise. I also think that there should be a lot of caution, again, because we're talking, especially with long COVID, a novel disease and now a novel treatment. But the truth of the matter is there's a lot of people who are, like I said, really desperate and are already trying these things. And for those that are having a benefit, I think that's great. I always again caution that without the proper container and the proper support, I'm not sure if all of those experiences are necessarily going to be the same. But my hope is that as scientists and researchers, that we can find out, are there psychedelics that are better than others? Is there a type of patient that would benefit from these? A lot of long COVID patients have symptoms of POTS or dysautonomia, which is essentially issues in how the nervous system balances itself. And, those patients ones that we need to be careful of? Are they patients that might actually have a greater improvement? We don't know the answers to these things right now. And these are really, really critical things that we need to find out so we can administer these medicines safely. That's my hope, to find the safest way to use them.
Yeah.
And obviously, to make sure that they're even indicated in the first place.
So can you tell me a bit more about the mechanism of how actually psychedelics could help with long COVID or any other chronic health conditions?
Yeah, so I think there's multifactorial ways in which psychedelics can help. Number one, stress is one of the biggest triggers for autoimmune conditions. This has been documented in the literature that when patients with autoimmune disease have a stressor, an emotional stressor, physical stressor, cognitive stressor, their illness can relapse or worsen for a couple of days. And we know that psychedelics have the ability to help decrease stress in our lives. They help give perspective. They help give the sense of feeling connectedness to other things, to nature, to other people, to something bigger than ourselves. And that inherently can help reduce the stress of life and the stress of managing a chronic illness. And they're also really been effective at helping with grief in certain instances. And there is so much grief that comes with losing parts of yourself, losing parts of your life, losing parts of what you thought your future was going to look like. And so softening that can be tremendously helpful. I think that is one piece. There's other, I think, really interesting physiologic ways that psychedelics work. So, for example, the serotonergic psychedelics have immunomodulatory and anti-inflammatory properties. As I mentioned when I was researching, DMT, there are there are properties that it can help potentiate the survival of brain cells in very, very challenging, low oxygen environments, inflammatory environments. So it's neuroprotective in some instances. And also, there's this concern that with long COVID, as I mentioned, there's people with POTS and with dysautonomia and all of that, and they have there's a theory that there's an imbalance in peripheral serotonin, and this imbalance in peripheral serotonin results in all of the nervous system dysfunction that we're seeing in many patients with long COVID. And so that's another way that psychedelics may be helpful. I say may and emphasize may because we're not yet sure, but I do think that there's multiple mechanisms that they can be helpful for long COVID.
And
And then,
obviously,
sorry, go ahead.
go on.
And I say this specifically to long COVID, especially the latter, because other chronic illnesses obviously have different mechanisms.
Yes, and yeah, just to reinforce that message that obviously it's not going to work for everyone. It will work for some people, but it's not going to work for everyone. And for some people, could be contraindications as well. Um,
Yeah, and to that point, especially with an illness like long COVID, where emotional stress, cognitive stress, physical stress, someone having an elevated heart rate for a long period of time, this can trigger a post-exertional malaise flare, which is essentially a period after 24, 48 hours where people just feel like they're crashing after one of these incidences. Or it could trigger a relapse, which can go on for weeks or months. And so, I say this with a lot of caution because, the container and the space and making sure the patient is as stabilized as possible before using these medicines is really, really important because as we know, psychedelic experiences can be very, very challenging. They can be very terrifying. They can be, they can trigger releases in cortisol, they can trigger stress. And that is the instance we want to avoid in someone who's already very, very sick and already struggling to leave the apartment, already struggling to leave the bed. They may come to psychedelics thinking, oh, this is going to make me better. And then, if it's not, if they're not properly assessed and if they're not properly being supported, it can result in one of these outcomes that we don't want.
Totally, makes so much sense. Yeah, always benefits and harms. We have to balance them. Brilliant. I would like to also, because I know we're running out of time a bit, but I have two more things I really want to know. I would like you to tell me more about your love to nature and visual arts.
Yeah, my love for nature. I mean, I grew up going to Vermont every other weekend of my childhood life. My parents immigrated from here and they were just taken with the snow and the fall and the leaves. And so we spent so much time there. And it's just the temperate forests of the Northeast are like in my bones. Like just I love them so much. And nature is as well. And that has just been a source of so much healing and inspiration for me and creativity. And I just feel like it is such a dear, dear family member. Um, yeah, and that's also inspired my work, my work with photography and film in the past. So
So you like nature film and photography, but in the past there was some kind of social activism, social change activism with your visual arts as well. Is that right?
yes, yes. In my 20s and 30s, I did, as I mentioned, I did a lot of international health, and one of my favorite parts of it was meeting such inspiring people, not unlike the psychedelic worlds as well. And I was so taken with what drew them to the work, what made them leave their homes and live in a remote part of the country. And I just wanted to share their stories. I was just really moved, and so that I did that for a period of time. Yeah.
Nice. I mean, I'm a filmmaker myself, so I completely understand. I feel like there's so many things we agree on. I'm just not as experienced in medical health as you, but I
I
think we'll align a lot.
I'd love to see your films.
I'll share definitely. Last thing I really want you to tell me is a bit more about your private practice. What do you do there, and what does it offer?
Yeah. So my private practice has been born out of all of these experiences and my research. And what it does is it combines holistic practice with psychedelics if it's appropriate for the patient, and yeah, focuses on long COVID care, psychedelics for end of life, psychedelics for chronic illness. In the US, ketamine is the psychedelic that is legal, so I'm working predominantly, I work with ketamine, but also provide support to individuals who may want to try or are trying different psychedelics, and really going through harm reduction principles and making sure that they're safe and that they have a safe container, and also, building a treatment plan for people that is, I would say alongside the pharmacologic model. And so helping people build a parasympathetic protocol, helping them work really closely on their diets, helping them work with the right types of supplements and Ayurveda and additions to what they're eating. And so it's really been a labor. I wouldn't even call it a labor. It feels like I've had to do this after everything that's happened. And I just want to be able to take what I've learned through my research and my personal experiences, most of my clinical work, and help other people who feel like they're stuck, feel like they're self-advocating, feel like they can't get the care they need from the Western medical system, and really just trying to not just reject that system, but optimize it for them.
Amazing. So if people need your help, they can contact you through your website, right?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, I would stay here for at least 2 hours, but I think we're running out of time. Last thing to summarize, conclusion, last message, whatever I didn't manage to cover. Do you have any more messages to people who are interested in treating long COVID or chronic illnesses with psychedelics or any other alternative out of the mainstream therapies, novel therapies?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is you're not alone. And I know that having a chronic illness can feel so isolating, and it can feel so exhausting that not only do you have to deal with being sick, but then you have to deal with figuring out how to help yourself, because the system is not built to help people with chronic autoimmune conditions that last a lifetime. You're not alone. And the second thing I would say is to make sure that if you are going to venture into trying things that, um, you know, might be sort of, we'll call them off label, get the right support. There are practitioners and people out there who can help you. And when you have a chronic illness, especially one like long COVID, as I described, make sure the container is so safe, and make sure the person that's with you knows what they're doing, because it can make a difference in how you respond.
Thank you. This is a great conclusion. It's all, yeah, we need help. We need community. We need support. And this is very Acer. This is very Acer message, by the way. So, well, Selena, thank you so much for being with me in this woodland Acer woodland walk. It was lovely to have you. And yeah, I hope we can catch up once you have some more data and share a bit more with us in the future.
Thank you so much, Anya. It was such a pleasure. And I could also be here for 2 more hours chatting with you. It was a really wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. We'll be back, Acer community. We'll be back. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.